The end of the world did not come through the fiery death of nuclear war that was so feared. Paradoxically, that could have been easier. At least in a nuclear catastrophe, one could imagine a slim chance of survival. What actually happened was much worse because it seemed hopeless. The highest government officials, those who make decisions about life and death, chose a different path. Biological weapons, they said, don't poison the earth, poison the people. This grim phrase echoed on television screens across the country. The rest of the world was not silent. Threats of biological retaliation raised the chaos to a climax. Panic gripped cities and villages. Protests broke out in every corner, in every community. People united in their anger. There was a strange paradox. In these dark times, we were finally standing together. I joined the protests, shouting along with thousands of others, hoping that our voices would change the course of events. And for a moment, it seemed like we had won. Governments began to talk about peace, sign treaties, and assure citizens that biological weapons would not be used. The protests died down, and people returned to their normal lives. But if I had looked more closely, I could have seen politicians hiding their fake smiles. Unfortunately, I didn't. Like everyone else, I was unprepared for what would happen next. Biological warfare didn't start with explosions or missiles. It came quietly, like a new disease that at first resembled the common flu, only more aggressive. By the time the seriousness of the situation became apparent, it was too late. My city was empty within days. Shops closed, schools closed, neighbors disappeared. At first, I thought people were just hiding in their homes, but calling friends and family revealed a grim reality. Almost everyone had lost someone close to them, and many were not answering their calls at all. The news became grimmer every night. Reporters, visibly ill, held onto their cameras with all their might. Eventually, even they began to collapse midair. On the seventh day after the outbreak began, I saw a famous anchor, Bella Morley, faint on air. That was the final push for me. I packed my belongings into my pickup truck and decided to drive to my family's summer house 100 miles away. Before I could leave town, the phone rang. The first in days. It was Ryan, my old friend and fellow engineer. He wasn't sick, but he said that almost everyone in his suburb had died, even the pets. We agreed to drive together, but first we had to stop at his parents' house. We left at dawn. What we saw looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. The roads were filled with abandoned cars. Most of the houses looked empty, and here and there you could see bodies. Several times we noticed figures in the distance, people or something else. We didn't dare to figure it out. We drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Ryan's parents' house looked intact from the outside, but the air of security was quickly dissipated. In the yard, we were met by a girl, Ryan's niece, Carolina. Her eyes were black as coal, her skin was gray, and there was dried blood on her face. She made a sound that sounded more like a growl than a human voice and started walking toward us. Ryan froze in place, but I was faster, grabbing his hand and pulling him to the car. We closed the gate, and Carolina, like a wild animal, began to scratch at it. Inside the house, things got even worse. We found Ryan's father in his bedroom. He was lying on the floor with his throat torn open, and the whole room was covered in blood. Ryan had fallen to his knees. His cries seemed inhuman. I couldn't stand to watch him suffer, so I decided to at least cover his body with a blanket, trying to restore some dignity to this terrible scene. We didn't stay long. Carolina continued to scratch at the gate, making terrible sounds that drowned out even our thoughts. When we finally left the place, Ryan didn't say a word. His silence was heavier than any words I could think of to comfort him. Along the way, we began to notice more and more horrific scenes. Groups of people who looked sick were wandering the streets, their movements jerky like puppets. They stood there, turning at the sound of the engine, but not daring to approach. It was not a relief, but only an increase in fear. They did not look like those who wanted help. Their eyes radiated emptiness. I felt that this horror was just beginning, and our survival depended on how much we were willing to distrust even those we once loved. I grabbed Ryan by the arm and pulled him to his feet. "We must escape now." I shouted, but he seemed frozen in a semi-conscious state, as if paralyzed by terror. We ran down the narrow corridor, trying to find a way out, but I had barely stopped to calm Ryan when I saw something that made me freeze. Ryan's mother, Mrs. Henderson, emerged from the door of his old room. She was wearing a dirty, blood-stained paisley dress that had long since lost its color. Her skin was gray as ash, and her eyes were as black as a bottomless pit, empty as the abyss. She held a child's hand in her hands, from which she was biting off pieces of flesh. Her face was disfigured. Part of her cheek had simply disappeared, exposing her teeth and a piece of her jaw. But the horror did not seem to bother her at all. Mrs. Henderson dropped her severed arm to the floor with a sickening thud and slowly, like a predator, turned her head toward us. She didn't scream. She didn't growl. Her blank stare and the calm licking of her lips at the remnants of blood were worse than any sound. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed everyone could hear it. I realized that she had probably killed everyone else in the house. Ryan froze like a stone statue. His eyes were fixed on his mother, or what was left of her. She raised her hand and took a step toward him, extending bony fingers that no longer belonged to a human. We found ourselves in a narrow hallway with no chance of escape. I did the only thing I could. I pushed Ryan in the back, pushing him back, and stood between him and the monster. Mrs. Henderson opened her mouth, thick, dark blood dripping from it, and tried to grab me. I pushed her back into the room, which still smelled of death, with all my might. Her husband's body lay there, torn and twisted like a doll. The thought flashed through my mind. What is this? How did this happen? But there was no time to answer. I slammed the door shut, holding it shut while I shouted to Ryan, "Run to the truck." He ran, and I followed, glancing around the backyard. Caroline, his little sister, was still wandering around, swaying like a marionette that had lost its strings. She turned her head toward me, her black eyes blazing with a blank stare. We jumped into the truck and took off without even closing the door all the way. My heart was pounding so hard I couldn't focus on the road. Ryan sat there, his head bowed. What was that? He finally whispered, but I didn't have an answer. All we knew was that this wasn't going to end like that. Our next stop was the police station. We hoped to find some help there, or at least a working radio. But when we pulled up, all we saw were charred walls and the remains of bodies still smoldering on the ground. Among the rubble lay broken furniture and overturned tables. "We're late," Ryan muttered, his voice breaking. He grabbed my hand. "Please don't stop here." I turned the ignition key and we drove toward my parents' house. The road was quiet, too quiet, except for Ryan's heavy breathing next to me. With each mile, I felt fear mingling with hope. What if everything was still okay there? But as soon as we saw the house, I realized that it was a vain hope. The first thing I saw was the broken stained glass window in the living room. The white curtain fluttered in the wind like a ghost waving goodbye to us. I turned off the engine, and we were left in an eerie silence. I didn't want to go out, but I had to. As I stepped onto the porch, my gaze fell on my father, standing in the middle of the room. His figure was visible through the broken glass. He was dragging something on the floor, a foot. My heart sank in my chest. I knew there was no point in going any further. He had killed my mother. My father looked just like Mrs. Henderson, black eyes, gray skin, and this inhuman calmness in his movements. My throat felt dry, and I turned back to the truck, trying not to let the tears flow. Ryan was silent as I started the engine again. We drove a few more miles before we saw an abandoned shopping mall. Deciding that it might be a safe place, we pulled into the parking lot. The mall loomed over us like a monument to a lost world. Its shattered windows and broken doors seemed like a maw ready to swallow us. We decided to climb onto the roof and enter through the service bay. Once on the roof, I paused for a moment, staring into the distance. The world I knew was falling apart. Ryan looked at me, and in his eyes I saw fear that never turned to tears. He whispered what I was afraid to think myself. This is the end of the world, right? I didn't answer. I just stared at the dark horizon, where smoke rose into the sky, and prayed that we could hold out for a little while. But deep down I knew the truth. It was just beginning.